Thanks for joining us, Fraser, and welcome back to Winnipeg. Can you bring us up to speed on what is going on at this year's AFN Assembly this morning?
Well, of course, day one is always sort of housekeeping things, so registration, things like that. It seems like they did make the right decision to delay the summer assembly, which is usually in July, to now, just because of the wildfires. There's a lot of people at registration, and it's a full house here, and so much so that Manitoba Premier Wapkinew had to delay his speech, I think, because they got started late because of the heavy registration. So he won't be speaking now until 3 p.m.
Fraser, can you also explain what are some of the key issues that will be discussed over the next few days?
Well, as you mentioned in your intro, this Bill C-5, the One Economy Act, remains a thorn in the side of a lot of First Nations. The way it was pushed through without very little consultation, as AMC Grand Chief Kyra Wilson said in her address, the First Nations have different views on projects, but the one thing that they didn't like was the process of this and the way that it was done with very little consultation. I think some of the other things you can see is there's going to be a lot of talk about reintroducing some of the things that have been promised or were introduced by the previous Trudeau government in this fall sitting in Parliament, which is the First Nations Clean Water Act, First Nations policing as essential services. They want to see legislation on that. Jordan's principle, of course, is always an issue. And really this long-term reform on long-term child welfare, which has kind of stalled since last October when the Chiefs in Assembly in Calgary voted that down. There's been very little movement, and I think there's even concern whether the original $47.8 billion that they had pledged is still an option. And of course also the First Nations infrastructure gap, which is massive at $350 billion.
And let's not forget about this crazy wildfire season as well. National Chief Cindy Woodhouse-Nepinak gave her opening address this morning, Fraser. What was your takeaway from that?
Well, I think she said the usual things from what I said, but I think that there's a lot of concern in Ottawa in particular and among First Nations, and rightfully so, that some of these long-term funding commitments and funding in general to First Nations issues is not going to be the same in the Carney government. It's supposed to be a lean budget. The economy is slowing, and of course the government has now committed to meeting its NATO commitments at 2% this year, which is going to be about $9 billion. So that's got to come from somewhere. So I think there's a lot of concern if the funding is going to be there for First Nations in general, as there has been in the past with the Trudeau government. And I'll just very quickly say also that Rebecca Alty, the Crown Indigenous Relations Minister, spoke very briefly just before I came on here. And again, it was a lot of talk about how the economy and the health economy comes first until things can be funded afterwards. It's a very different approach that they're taking. And again, she's only here for a short time, gone already. And of course, under the Trudeau government, you would see ministers, the IC minister, Northern Affairs minister, often that would be here. They're not, and it's a much more controlled sort of approach, I think, to First Nations issues.
Fraser, we'll have to leave it there. Fraser Needham will have more from the AFN on tonight's newscast. Thank you, Fraser.